Welcome to York, for those of you who are not at York. I'm John Local. I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research here, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the official York launch of the York Environmental Sustainability Institute. And I see Sue writing down so she can remember what it is. Good. Before I introduce our guest of honour, Professor Georgina Mace, I'd just like to say one or two words about Iucn. The work of Iucn, one of our hugely successful collaborative hubs, is intended to help the university to lead the way in environmental research. The Institute has a mission to enable, support and promote the delivery of world-class interdisciplinary research on environmental sustainability, collaborating with organisations, the research community, industry and policymakers. Iucn's innovative approach to interdisciplinary research draws together physical, natural and social sciences and focuses on critical societal challenges with significant impact and potential for research. We're here tonight not only to celebrate the launch of Iucn in the university's 50th year, and I have to say that, if I don't say that, it's part of the, I get told off, but also to celebrate with the British Ecological Society in their centenary year. And I'm delighted to welcome the president of the BES, as I've been told to call it, rather than reiterating the words, Professor Georgina Mace, to deliver her keynote speech. Georgina is Professor of Biodiversity and Ecosystems at University College London. Before joining UCL in 2012, she was director of the NERC Centre for Population Biology at Imperial College. Her research interests are in measuring the trends and consequences of biodiversity loss and ecosystem change. She led the development of criteria for listing species on the International Union for Conservation of Nature's Red List of threatened species, and was a coordinating lead author for biodiversity in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Recently, she's worked on the UK National Ecosystem Assessment and is a co-investigator on the NERC Valuing Nature Network, as well as Associate Director of the Ecosystem Services for Poverty Alleviation Programme. She was elected an FRS in 2002 and was the 2007 winner of the International Cosmos Prize. She's currently a member of NERC Council, President of the British Ecological Society and Chair of the Science Committee for the Diversitas Global Change Research Programme. It gives me great pleasure to invite Georgina to deliver her lecture, A Planet and Its People Under Pressure. Georgina.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here. It's always good to come to York, and I wanted to just start off by mentioning part of the background to this meeting, which is, as we've already heard, around the 50th anniversary of the University of York, the 100th anniversary of the British Ecological Society, and the launching, I'm not sure launching is the right word from Institute, but anyway, whatever it is, of Iucn. And I think there are several things that bring all of these together. So one is York is very well known for its ecology. I would say that many, not quite all, but most of the country's favourite ecologists are in York. And BES has had many leaders who came from York. So we have a strong history here. The global change ecology area is one that York and maybe the universities in this part of the country, Leeds as well, I think, push very well on. I would say they are nationally excellent in that area. And it's also an area that BES thinks is important for ecology in the future. So we have one of the initiatives for our centenary is to think about areas that ecology as a science can contribute more to in future. And maybe ecology has tended in the past to be a bit too much about the detail, looking down into systems. And we like to think that ecology could become more expansive and look out. And global change sciences is one of the areas where we'd like that to happen. So all these things come together and make this meeting, and it's been a really great meeting so far, and I hope I don't spoil it for you. So what I'm going to do in this talk is, well, Sue gave me this title actually, because she saw it in an editorial where I was having a rant about something, and then I agreed to give it under this title, and then realised I didn't really want to talk about it at all. But what I'm going to do is talk a bit more about biodiversity and ecosystems. So in the middle of the talk, you'll get something where I know a little bit about the subject I'm talking about. I'm going to start off with the planet and people under pressure bit, which is the trends in population and consumption, and is some of the work that came out of this Royal Society People and the Planet report. And then at the end, I'm going to try and draw it back to why it matters and some things that we can do about it, which I hope will lead into some of the discussions that will take place tomorrow. So starting with the people thing, there are a lot of people on the Earth. The numbers have actually been growing very rapidly, very recently. So for the largest part of human history, there were really relatively few people. It took us till, I think, 1800 to get to the first billion. Now we're at 7 billion, and the last billion was added in just 12 years. So that gives you a sense of this very rapid rise in the human population. Actually, this axis is really weird. Don't look at it in too much detail. It doesn't actually scale properly. And as a species, we dominate the planet. So this is another x-axis that has a very weird set of numbers. But if you just look at where we are now, we are using a very large part of the planet for croplands, rangelands, for semi-natural habitats. And so the amount of wildlands or unconverted habitat is now very small. We probably use 40% of all the net primary productivity, but we've converted very large parts of the Earth system. And most of that has also happened very recently. So this is just the bit in the latter part of the last century. So why do we worry about population? Everybody worries about population, and actually there are a couple of slightly different reasons. One is it gets very crowded sometimes, and I gave a lecture where somebody told me it was all about how busy it was on Waterloo Station, and you know, that is pretty annoying, but it's not the main reason that we worry about population. There are also crowded conditions that lead to significant problems for people. So the growth of slums, and the fact that overcrowding, particularly in parts of the developing world, has very significant health and well-being implications for large numbers of people. And this is mostly an urbanization problem, and it seems to be one of the main reasons why we're not on target to meet the Millennium Development Goal about infant mortality rate. So crowding and living in poor conditions is definitely an issue. I'm not really going to talk about that one. I'm going to talk about this one, which is the concern that we're reaching environmental limits, that there are more people than the Earth can support. And there have been two approaches to examining that question. Are there too many people on the Earth? Have we exceeded the Earth's carrying capacity? So this is one that comes from WWF's Living Planet report. Actually, this is slightly out of date now. They've been maintaining it for a while. And it's a sort of a counting exercise. You add up how much resource use people require, particularly in terms of land use area. It's all converted to a common metric of land requirement. And then you see how much of that land there is. And we went into deficit. So we started using more than one planet, I think, in 1986. So we are already, according to this analysis, borrowing from the future. We are in debt. And when Johan Rockström talks about invoices from the environment, one way to think about that is we've already borrowed from the future. There are some issues with this approach because of the accounting side. It turns out to not be very good at dealing with new ways of doing things or additive uses of the same area of land, and it's very much dominated by carbon. The second approach is the one that Johan Rockström talked about a bit this morning, which is a systems-based approach. So you don't think about this accounting of adding up people's uses and benefits, but you look at systems where thresholds of some sort are likely to be met. And he talked about this and in terms of how those thresholds are set and whether they work equally well across all these systems. And I think it's pretty clear they work better for some systems than others, and they probably work best for the climate system. Some of these others, it's very difficult to say where the boundaries are. Now, the question about whether there are too many people is actually the wrong one anyway. Joel Cohen wrote a fantastic book called How Many People Can the Earth Support? It's a very long book, and there is never an answer to it. And that's because the answer to that question depends very much on what those people are doing, where they're living, what sort of lifestyle they have, how long they live, what sorts of communities they live in, what their attitudes and expectations and perceptions are. And so there isn't really an answer to it, except to say that we want there to be more equal access to the Earth's benefits. And that's true for the people who live on the Earth now, but it's also true for generations to come. Now, exactly how many generations to come, I don't know, but we need to think about several generations ahead of us and not just the present. And that's why the growth in the human population is important. So Sarah Harper talked about this. This is the UN projection from 2010. Here's the 7 billion where we were at in 2011. And here's the expectation of reaching 10 billion. But the uncertainty on that is very large. And that uncertainty is explained almost entirely by what will happen to fertility rates in the large areas of the developing world. But it makes a big difference to the planet, whether we're up here at 16 billion or back down at 7. Now, Sarah also talked about this. So what's been happening, there's lots of good news in the population area. Death rates have come down, birth rates have come down, and that's exactly what you expect on the demographic transition. And for some areas of the world, that means population is more or less stabilized. So these are country groups shown according to their income levels. These are high-income countries, OECD high-income countries, low-income, lower middle and upper middle. And you can see that despite the decline in the death rate and the decline in the birth rate, the middle income, well, the upper middle, which is kind of the what she called the middle development country group, is increasing very rapidly. And that's the area where most people actually live. This here, the low-income countries, this is mostly sub-Saharan Africa, is not growing so fast, and actually there are rather fewer people there. So this is the one that makes a big difference in time to come. So it's not only how many people there are on the Earth, it's what they're actually doing that makes a difference to the impact on the planet. And in my world, you very rarely go out and collect data. You collect data that other people have collected for other reasons, and you end up with very bizarre data sets. Actually, I didn't collect this one, but it is a very bizarre data set. This is population since 1750, and that's 2000. So that's what I've already shown you of what's happening to global population. Now, all these other plots, which you probably won't be able to read what they are things that people do. So this is stuff that's going on. This is different measures of consumption. Damming of rivers, water use, fertilizer consumption, urban population, paper consumption, transport motor vehicles. And all of those are increasing faster than population is. And the one that's increasing fastest is this one here, McDonald's restaurants. So this Martian who comes and looks at planet Earth and takes a sample of what's going on would have the clear take-home message that this is what we're really keen on at the moment. But the point about this is that population may be growing quickly, but things that people do, stuff that people do, is growing faster. And of course, that's not equal either. Here's the fertility rates across these different country groups. So from low income to high income, and this is the average family size, more or less. And then if we look at, so here's GDP per capita, there's a sort of measure of wealth. You can see that goes up with the higher income countries. These are some measures of consumption: meat equivalent, water withdrawal, vegetation equivalents per capita. You can see all of those go up where fertility rates going down. So in the areas with the highest fertility, we have a long way to go for them to reach those same expectations that there are in the West. CO2 emissions, actually there's a very complicated picture, mainly because of the Middle Eastern states. There's big variance there, but on the whole it goes the same way around. And then this one is the Human Development Index. So this is independent of economies, and it's independent of consumption. It's another measure of well-being. It includes education and various other societal metrics. And one of the other bits of good news here is that the HDI continues to increase, and actually continues to increase in these middle-income countries faster than anywhere else. So there are some good trends. The problem is to manage that while not creating huge problems with these other areas where there's still a lot of consumption to be grown. So that was average levels, and this is rates of change. So we're back to rates of growth here. So this is the average annual rate of increase of various measures. Again, red is population, and the blue ones are all measures of consumption. And there are two things to say about this. Is in almost all areas, except perhaps the low-income countries, the measures of consumption are growing faster than population, quite markedly so in these middle and high-income countries. And the other is that some of these measures of consumption are really growing at a very high rate. So if you project all this forward to 2050, 2080, you can end up with the effects of consumption being 4, 5, 6 times higher than the effects of population alone. So that's a little summary of what's going on with population. We already dominate the Earth. We manage it mostly for our immediate needs, especially food, energy, and water. Numbers of people are still increasing. Consumption's growing faster than population. Land use change continues, and climate change impacts are yet to come. So we're going to need more environmental resources for more people, and we want to be able to distribute them more equitably, and we're going to do all this in a changing environment, including climate change. So that's the first part. Now I want to talk a little bit about impacts of all that on biodiversity and ecosystems. And then at the end, I'll try and bring the two back together. So what is biodiversity? I'm going to use it in a very generic sense, not in the sense that most biologists use it, but just in the way that the conventional biological diversity defines it, as really just meaning the variety of life. So it isn't just species diversity or species richness. It's a variety of life at all these levels, from genes, populations, variety of ecosystems, everywhere on the planet. But also, rather importantly, and the CBD actually says this, the interactions between living things. So it's not just maintaining all the bits, it's maintaining the way that they interact with each other, or the potential for those interactions to be maintained. And that turns out to be very important for many of the things that we rely on ecosystems for. We don't even really know, we're not even close to knowing how many species there are on the Earth. We've probably described less than a tenth, and the ones that we have described are the ones that we know very well. So we've described most of the vertebrates, which are this little bar down here. But for the insects, the arthropods, generally, there's millions that are undescribed. And even for really significant groups like fungi and some plants, there are large numbers of species that have not even been identified or given a name. So our knowledge of biodiversity is pretty weak. There's a really nice paper came out last couple of years ago trying to come up with a new estimate of how much diversity there is at the species level. And it's based on these accumulation curves for higher order taxonomic levels. And you get this, I don't quite understand why this is, but they line up very nicely, which means that if you know how many phyla class orders there are, and we've started saturating on those, you can get an estimate for the number of species. And that's what happens when you do that sum. We predict there will be 8.7 plus or minus 1.2 million species globally, and 86% of those still await description. So we're still a long way off knowing about the biodiversity of the Earth. So what's happening to that biodiversity? Now, I'm going to draw some of this from this book that was produced by my ex-colleagues at ZSL on evolution loss, just because it has some very nice graphics in it. It's very difficult to get a comprehensive view of what's happening to biodiversity. But this is the best we can get, the best data that you can get on what's happening to populations of species. So this isn't a species level plot. This is a normalized population size across many thousands of species where population abundance has been measured between 1970 and 2005. And so if the populations of that group of species were the same now as in 1970, this would lie on the level line. And there's obviously various kinds of uncertainty about it. So marine fish seem to be taking a bit of a dip recently, but were apparently doing okay. Freshwater fish and amphibians are the really bad news stories. Most populations of freshwater fish and amphibians have been in decline, and actually quite dramatic declines. Look at the amphibians, which are going down to 10% of their 1970 levels. Freshwater fish down to about 20%. Birds are doing pretty well. Mammals are doing not brilliantly. And reptiles, although there's lots of uncertainty about them, turn out to be pretty resilient to lots of things going on in the world. So that's populations. This is species. So how many species have gone extinct is, again, one of these very difficult questions to answer when you don't know how many species there are. This is the most conservative measure you can come up with. So these are species that definitely had a name, definitely existed, people knew they were there, and when anyone went back to look for them, they were gone. So these are minimum numbers of extinctions, but you can see they come from a really rather small pool of species for which it's been assessed. So we don't know very clearly what the current extinction rate is. We can make some estimates of it. We do know that a lot of current species are threatened with extinction. So 11,000 vertebrate species are threatened with extinction on the Iucn Red List, which is an extraordinary number of species. And those are distributed across different groups. This plot shows you the proportion of species that are threatened. So if they're yellow, orange, or red, they're regarded as being at risk of extinction. If they're grey, we know so little about them, it's impossible to say. And you can see there's a lot of variation between groups. So the amphibians, again, turn out to be the worst group, with about 30% known to be at risk of extinction and about another 20% for which it's unclear. The best groups are the birds do pretty well. Birds may be more resilient to environmental change than people had understood them to be. And then there are some here's the reptiles again, which are not looking too bad. There are some groups like cycads, which are regionally restricted to areas that are undergoing rapid change, where you get very high rates. But anyway, we have a lot of species that are endangered. And if you put, and then the third level, so I've done below the species level populations, at the species level species. The third level we can look at is biomes. So these are the original vegetation types on the Earth. In theory, if you removed all the people, this is what vegetation would revert to, although Chris Thomas told us wouldn't be like that actually, which I think is true. But these are the original vegetation types, so tropical and subtropical moist broadleaf forests, dry broadleaf forests, and so on. So here are the temperate ones, the orange and the light green. And what we can do is look at the extent of change to those original habitat types, original biomes. So the light orange here is how much of those had been converted by people up to 1950. The orange is how much was converted between 1950 and 1990. And the red with the error bar on is the projection forward, how much will be converted between 1990 and 2050. So you can see in these temperate areas, most of that habitat was gone by 1950. Well over 50% was gone by 1950. and then there was really very little left to convert after that. There's been some restoration of woodland and forest in the northern temperate zone, so that's good news. The problem is these areas, the tropical and subtropical grasslands, forests and so on, to date, well, they've still been converted quite extensively. These are the areas that hold most biodiversity. They are the biodiversity-rich areas of the world. And those are the ones that are projected to be converted next. So that makes it a kind of double hit, that not only will those areas be lost, but all the species that they contain will be lost as well. So this is a summary of what's happening to biodiversity that was produced for the International Year of Biodiversity in 2010. So this is an aggregated measure, the state of biodiversity from 1970 to 2010. It is really sad that we can't do this before 1970. We just have no data reliably that goes back before 1970. But that's a measure of the state, how much, based on all the kinds of things I've shown you, population, species, habitat integrity and so on. And you can see we'd lost about a third of it by 2010. This second graph is an accumulated measure, index of all the pressures on biodiversity, the things that we're doing that lead to it being lost. So it's to do with habitat conversion, pollution, alien invasive species and so on. And you can see that's going up. There's no sign that the pressures are levelling off. The third one is our responses to it. So what have been the policy and decision responses that should be ameliorating these facts, should be making this level off and that go up? Well, that's going up as well. The responses are going up, actually rather successfully. We're doing lots of the right things. But the really strong message from this is we're clearly way off doing this on the scale, nature, quality or quantity of responses that are needed, because this is still going up and that's still going down. And you can't expect biodiversity declines to cease until the pressures start levelling off, and you can't expect the pressures to start levelling off until the responses to those threatening processes are actually scaled up. So that was a pretty depressing outcome to the year of biodiversity. The other thing about those pressures is that, of course, they're changing over time. That in the past, the main threats to species were from invasive species overexploitation. In the present, it's mostly about habitat change and to some extent about pollution. But if we look forward, there are these, well, particularly the new threat from climate change, which has really barely had an impact yet, but also concerns about pollution and, of course, continuing habitat change. So it's a very dynamic set of processes that are driving that decline. This is a summary of various methods to compare extinction rates in the past, the present, and the future. So this is a fairly good measure of extinction rate in the fossil record, what people like to call background rates of extinction. And this axis here is measured as the number of extinctions per million species years, which is just a way of calibrating between data where you've got long, thin data sets and short, fat data sets. So back in the Cenozoic, which is what this one was from, species had lifetimes of 1 million years or so. If you go up to the present, now this is really good data. This is the extinction data that I already showed you. This is an absolute minimum. The bottom of that is a minimum extinction rate for the present. And you can see that's already 2 orders of magnitude higher than that background rate. And if you assume that lots of the critically endangered species go extinct as well, it goes up to the top of that one. So in the present, we've already gone up 2 orders of magnitude in extinction rates. Now, these others are a range of modelling exercises for extinction rates in the 21st century, and using either climate change or land use change or combined drivers as the causes. And there's lots of variation in here. And some of them go very high. Some of them go another 2 orders of magnitude up in extinction rates. Some of them have lower levels that are lower than the current extinction rate. And that's because there are many, many different assumptions in these models. But the bottom line is that we're still a couple of orders of magnitude off these background rates. So we've already elevated extinction rates a great deal. So why does it matter that we're losing biodiversity and ecosystems? Maybe that's just part of dynamic change on planet Earth and everything will recover to deal with it. So I'm going to very briefly touch on 3 reasons to care about biodiversity. The first is this thing that's called intrinsic or inherent value, which is just we should care about it because it's there and we share the planet with it. Second set of arguments about the genetic library of life, and I want to touch a little bit on this adaptation potential for innovation that comes in there. And then the third one, the instrumental and extrinsic values. So this is where we get into the ecosystem services and the utility for people set of arguments. So intrinsic values, I can't really say any more about it except that people care about nature because it's nature. People like it because it's there. What exactly people care about is very dependent on particular times and places and societies. But there are certain qualities of nature that are of immense value to people. You can't put a price on them. And if you can't put a price on them and you can't even rank them in terms of their importance, it's very difficult to make decisions about them. But for some people, these intrinsic values dominate their discussions of the natural world. And we just can't forget about them. I'm not going to talk about it anymore because it's very difficult to deal with, but just to say that it's fully recognized to be an important concern. Now, the genetic library of life is really an important thing to think about, that all the species that we have on the Earth, all the communities where those species are interacting with each other, are the product of millions of years of evolution, where those genomes and the interactions between species and within communities have been finely tuned to the environment in which they live. The evolutionary history is reflected in the extant species in the tree in which they live. And every time you lose a species, or a genus, whatever it is, you lose that whole suite of evolutionary history that went with it. And that is irreversible. There is no way to reverse that. It's the one thing that makes extinctions profoundly different from other kinds of environmental change. The loss of that is irreversible. And that genetic variation, maybe it was a dead end, but it is the source of all living material now, of all future biological communities on which our future is going to rest. So it's an important consideration, the source of innovation, adaptability and resilience. The third area that I want to just mention is about these extrinsic values. So what do biodiversity and ecosystems do for us? Well, they're the raw material for many of the immediate material goods that we depend on, such as food, fibre and fuel. Biodiversity and ecosystems provide a whole range of services to do with climate regulation, protection against natural hazards. They provide pathogen and pest regulation for free. Those material goods depend on good soils and regulation of water quality and quantity, which is also provided by organisms and within ecosystems. And there's this sense of place and identity, recreational values that come from many wild places as well. And there are also evolutionary benefits that come from having that diversity of life around. So all these are things that in theory you could put a value on. You could say what other costs they offset or what their relative benefits are to people. Now, there's been a long history of work looking at how much those ecosystem functions depend on biodiversity. Actually, John Norton started a lot of this 20 years ago, and this figure here is the synthesis of all the experiments that have happened in the last 20 years that aim to look at that relationship. How much does diversity per se contribute to ecosystem functions? So it doesn't really matter what the diversity is in. It could be genetic, species level, functional traits or habitats. if you just put all that data together, as diversity increases, the ecosystem function increases. There's a lot of error around it. Now, of course, that doesn't mean always that diversity is good. These red blobs here are the maximum and minimum that would come for that function from a monoculture, from just one species. So if you like, agricultural production is exploiting that there's a crop type that's a better producer than lots of crop types together. But if you want to maintain diversity and options for the future, then more diversity is better. And this is another synthesis that comes from looking beyond ecosystem functions, but to ecosystem services. So for all these ecosystem services, these real benefits that we get from ecosystems that we can add up the value of, how much do they depend on diversity per se? So again, this is diversity, not amount. So there's lots of detail in here you don't really need to worry about. It tells you what kind of measure of diversity it is and whether it was a plant or whether it was an ecosystem in that case. And these are the predicted relationships from theory. Some of them should be positive, some of them should be negative. And you can see mostly the experiments give you what you expect. There's a few where they don't. The red and the yellow ones, which are complicated sets of services. But for most of these provisioning services, the stuff that we need to eat, crops, fisheries, wood and fodder, the relationships are positive. More is better. For many of the regulating services, climate, soil quality, water quality, the relationships are positive. Some of the biocontrol, you get a more common negative relationship, which is entirely to be expected. So it's not true that all ecosystem services depend on having more diversity. But if you don't have diversity, your options for future ecosystem services are substantially reduced. So biodiversity loss is continuing, often at increasing rates, and it matters to us for very many reasons that I've skimmed over very quickly. I suspect, and I actually would say that I believe this is true, that biodiversity may be more important in the future than now because of these increasing pressures, the multiple demands on ecosystems, and the changing environment. That means we're going to need that adaptability more than we have now. So, what can be done about it? Now, this is a really difficult set of things to address, and all I'm going to do is draw on a few examples of some positive outcomes. And I'm going to use a little schema to do that. So if you think of any ecosystem, this happens to be an East German woodland for no particular reason, what people have done, what we have grown our civilizations on, is using those ecosystems to produce a set of immediate benefits. Food production, fresh water, flood control, energy, all these things that we gain from within ecosystems. And what's happened recently, and this is what Johan Rockström was talking about this morning, is we've started to have to do so much of some of these, like food production, that they've started interfering with the others. Or we've done so much of some of them, like energy, that they're reaching thresholds beyond which they can't go. And it's causing us a problem because we're not very good at managing all of them together. We're quite good at one at a time. And all those are affected by what we in the Millennium Assessment call the direct drivers, so the things that actually affect biodiversity in ecosystems, climate change, land and seas change, pollution, globalization. These are all things that affect how much benefit we get here. But those, are, of course, are driven by much more distal drivers that have to do with society and population and demography and technology and innovation and so on. And, of course, there are lots of feedbacks in here that make it very complicated. Now, if you want to do something about intervening to enable there to be more of these things produced from ecosystems to support this growing world, there are different points in this where you can try and intervene and do things differently. And I'm just going to try and illustrate a few of those. So the first one is there are things that we can do just by doing a better job of managing particular habitats, particular ecosystems. So these are local interventions within ecosystems. And there are lots of these. We can do food production better, we can do energy production better. I'm going to draw on the example of conservation of species and habitats, because it's one where actually when people have put their mind to it, for species they really care about, and for habitats that they care about, they can restore them and save them. And it's no coincidence that this isn't a random set of species. These are the sorts of species people like to conserve, and the sorts of habitats people like to conserve, and it's been quite successful. And this is a plot we did again for 2010 that illustrates that this can be successful on a gross scale. So this is the Red List index for birds, mammals, and amphibians, and I've already shown you the data that goes into creating that index, but it's essentially a synthesis of all the data that goes into the Red List to look at trends in species persistence. And here's the amphibians that start off lower and are going down faster. Now, here's the birds, mammals, and amphibians separated out. The red line is what that curve would have looked like in the absence of any conservation action, in the absence of any work by the conservation organisations. Now, you may not think this is very impressive, but I think the bird one is really pretty impressive. And there's been a lot of work on bird conservation, and it's been able to turn what would have been a curve like that into a curve like that, and hopefully in the future it could go on and recover. Of course, we've done a lot more conservation of birds than we have of mammals, and we've done a lot more of birds and mammals than we have of amphibians. So here's the poor old amphibians that are still heading down fast because nobody's done any serious conservation work on them, at least until the last 5 years or so. So conservation does work. We can do habitat management. The second one I want to look at is a slightly broader scale look at land use planning. And I'm going to use some of the work we did on the UK National Ecosystem Assessment for this. So this was a 2-year DEFRA project to look at the UK's ecosystems and the benefits people get from them. And we looked at a range of ecosystem services. These are the ecosystem services. And we actually looked at the benefits that people get and tried to do some economic valuation of those benefits. So this is trying to bring economics into land use for more than just the traditional landscape uses for which values are significant. So most land use at the moment is driven by agriculture, crops and livestock, and most of these have no say in the market, and therefore they're sort of side benefits of land use rather than direct benefits. So there was a lot of work that went on to try and get estimates of the value of these, and particularly how they would change under different sorts of land use in the UK. And I'm going to just show you 2 scenarios. Nature at Work, which was a scenario where in the next 50 years, ecosystem services would be encouraged through multifunctional landscapes where the right landscape was used for the right kind of ecosystem service. So places that were good for water purification would be used for water, places that were good for carbon sequestration would be used for carbon, places that were good for agriculture would be used for agriculture, and so on. So there's a broader range of benefits that were driving land use decisions. And world markets is a sort of business as usual scenario where most land use decisions come from agricultural prices and are driven by high economic growth primarily. So this is what those 2 look like. So this is really complicated, I'm afraid. So this is the UK in 2050 with a high climate change scenario. So we've changed the environment as it would be under high climate change. And these are different ecosystem service benefits. This is agricultural value. This is a traditional one. Greenhouse gas emissions, so the contribution to carbon sequestration or net carbon sequestration. Changes in recreational values, some methods for looking at the value of green spaces. This is a particular urban green space which has a different valuation system, and this is a wild bird diversity index. So all of these, if it's red, it's worse than today. If it's green, it's better than today. So they're just changes in value, not absolute values. And the amounts vary a lot depending on what you're looking at. So the actual monetary values are quite significantly different here, but I haven't got time to go into that. The bird one isn't valued, actually. It's just bird diversity per se. So here's world markets. Actually, you can see that the UK kind of does well agriculturally out of climate change. Agricultural production will be better in a climate change world. But for all the others, for greenhouse gas emissions, there's much more red in world markets. For recreational values, substantially more, and particularly for the urban green space, and of course for biodiversity. And the really, I mean, in a way this isn't surprising because you're maximizing all these. But actually, if you look at the changes in value, some of these are substantial benefits. The recreation and health benefits of urban green space are really very large compared to the changes in agricultural value. So it's not just that you could make the UK landscape work for many more things better by taking the wider benefits from ecosystems into account. It's also that the total amount of benefit increases. And of course, biodiversity itself, or in here reflected by bird species richness, is much better under nature at work. And when we ran the scenario just to maximize biodiversity or to maximize bird species richness, it was not substantially different from the nature at work one. Okay. The third one I want to talk about is up here, is in the population and demography area. So one of the things that's always puzzled me is about the relative impact of reducing fertility versus reducing consumption. So I'm going right back to the first part of my talk now. And this is just a little very simple analysis built on real life table data for India and for the USA. So I'm not a demographer, but I am a population biologist, so I can run life table models even if they're for people. And this is what happens. If you take India, where we are now, and you say, what would happen to consumption times population? You give everybody a consumption unit of 1 to start with. If we reduce fertility by 1% a year for 50 years. Well, actually, the Indian population goes on growing because it's got a very high inertia behind it. There's a lot of population growth in India still to come, and it doesn't level off for another 50 or 60 years or so. If you do the same thing with consumption, so this is now this is consumption times population, and you reduce it by 1% a year for 50 years, this is what you get. You hold down that consumption times population impact until the 50 years is reached, and then it shoots back up again. In the USA, which is a country which is actually close to replacement level, the fertility rate is about 2. So if you reduce fertility, it still takes a little while to come in because of the generation time, but then it has quite a big impact. Whereas here's what happens with consumption. It immediately takes the impact down. So the point about this is, it isn't really population or consumption. It's doing both. And you have to, in the long run, deal with population, because otherwise everything goes on shooting up completely unsustainably. But there are huge benefits to be gained by cutting consumption in the short term. Those early gains are very quick. They can happen overnight. You can change people's behavior and attitudes very quickly. So I think building some more positive stories around this at this high level of decision making would be really useful. And then the fourth one is just generally making better decisions about land use at a much higher level. And I'm just, actually, Johan Rockström showed this slide, but this is a really nice example of if you manage the planet like an engineer would, where you just optimize it for food production, you could feed people in a very small part of the planet, and it has many co-benefits in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The areas that you'd use for agriculture are not the areas that are significant for biodiversity, reduces pollution and water use. Of course, politically, this is incredibly difficult. It means that the whole world would be dependent on a few relatively small areas of high-quality food production. But there's no reason why this kind of analysis for decision-making can't contribute more to better policies at high level. So why doesn't all this happen? These are my conclusions, really. I think there are many opportunities to reverse some of these trends. Most of them are stalled for various reasons. One of them is about gaps in knowledge and information. And I was interested to see that Yessi has a theme about the evidence base. And I think part of the problem about the evidence base is we don't have the data and we don't have the knowledge. But there's a whole area of kind of understanding when we know enough to act. And I think in many of these areas we do already know enough to act. We would just like to know more. And getting those areas where we really don't know enough, just to the point where there's enough to make a sensible decision, is a really good first priority. Secondly, we have these really serious market failures in current policy mechanisms. There are things that matter a lot to people, including the future of energy and food, that are not well reflected in markets that drive most big decisions that go on in the world. And trying to understand and be able to intervene in that system seems to me to be really important. And then the third one, which is very broad, is environmental governance at all scales. We are just very weak on environmental governance at the local and the regional and the global scale. And I do think that the science here is running ahead of the decision-making policy and governance systems, and to try and bring those two closer together would be a really useful thing to do. So I think I'll draw it to a close then. Thank you for listening.